Okay, welcome to El Maestro. My name is Victor Lecce III, and you are with me. Today is Monday, May 19th, and welcome to the sixth episode of this podcast. I'm glad you are with me. We have some fantastic content for you today. I hope you're still enjoying this fantastic weather. You're like, when will it end? Hopefully not anytime soon. We are approaching summer. And this is how I like it. Right around the 80s, it's just gorgeous. But once it gets to the 90s, it gets a little too hot. For my Englander friends or people listening overseas, I guess that would mean around the 20s I like it, Celsius. And maybe the low 30s, but after that, it starts to get a bit hot. I think I got that correct. But anyways, I'm glad you're with me. I have a lot of good content for you today. Let me go ahead and do our normal items that we start off on the top of the show. One thing that I've been forgetting is that is just where to find this podcast and that you can follow me. You can follow me on Facebook, Victor Lecce III. The last name is spelled Lecha. I believe I'm the only Victor Lecce III on Facebook. So you can follow me there for just posts and different contents. Some of the topics that we end up discussing in the podcast, I post. But there are a lot of other things that I post, and they don't make it into the podcast. So if you want to follow and comment, feel free. I would love that. Also, you can find the podcast on Spotify and also on YouTube. And that is where we're placing the podcast right now. I have wanted to go ahead and do some highlight reels for you on TikTok and on Instagram, but I got to be honest with you, it takes a long time and I'm not really getting the kind of viewership or feedback that makes it really worthwhile. So I think either I'm going to maybe only have a couple of highlights or a couple of reels, so that way it doesn't take too much time, or I might not do that at all. But for sure, you can follow me on Facebook, Victor Lecce III. You can find the podcast on Spotify or YouTube. So that's those items. The other thing are just, if you haven't listened to the podcast, just some things to be aware of. First and foremost, I may munch during my podcast, and I hope that doesn't deter you. But I just like to go ahead and get a little munching in to give me a little more energy, to give you the content that you require and deserve. And speaking of energy, sometimes I have to go ahead and take a monster too. So if you hear me munching or drinking drinking a monster, I hope that doesn't deter you. I hope you keep listening. It's only for a little while, and I don't do it on every podcast. The other thing, and you might have noticed it already, is that I suffer from ADHD, known as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And I don't say it to get your sympathy, although if you're going to give it to me, I surely will take it. But I say it only because sometimes I may have trouble bringing up the content to my mind, or the facts that are pertinent to the story that I'm talking about, or I may get things reversed, and I may get things a little wrong. And if that's the case, don't worry about it. I listen to the podcast during the week, and I do what's called corrections on the following podcast. And I go through everything that I had stated incorrectly or was a little bit off. So that's it. I believe that's all of the items that we normally talk about before we begin the podcast. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get right into corrections, because I got a lot of content to give you today, and I want to make sure that we stay at that hour. So most of these corrections were in regards to the United Kingdom news that I was bringing you last week, not yesterday, on the last podcast. We were talking about the tariff trade deal, or the trade deal that was struck between President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and I was saying how I didn't think that was a good deal for UK residents, UK consumers, and UK businesses. But I said that UK residents, unfortunately, going to have to pay a 10% tariff tax on their exports. And that's incorrect. You actually, there in the beautiful United Kingdom, will not be paying that, but the UK businesses will as well. And then you can see a little example of the ADHD there for you. The second thing is, also I got mixed up, is I was speaking about how the debt in the United Kingdom is the largest we've seen since the 60s. And that part of the reason why Labor is putting in a lot of these, budgetary cuts, or this more of, say, a Tory or conservative-like fiscal policy, is because of how high the debt is. And I was saying how the Tories had really ran up the debt and went up 163% during the times they were in office. But I was talking about how Labor really has to find another way to resolve this debt crisis instead of taking it out on the middle class, the vulnerable, the poor, those who really need and require those benefits to be able to have a decent quality of life. And what I said, though, is I said, so here come these tax cuts that they're going to vote for in June, because they're proposing a bunch of other budget cuts to different benefits. But I said tax cuts, and it really should have been budget cuts. So that was another correction. Another correction is I actually had it right and then reversed it. The winter fuel payments that many UK residents used to receive has now been cut for those who don't qualify under the means testing. And then I said, no, that wasn't correct. It's just it was more restricted. But no, they actually did put means testing on the winter fuel payments, which have locked out about 11 million from those payments. And just so you know, and I'm skipping a little ahead of myself here, but that is the primary reason why Labor did not do well in this recent election. They lost like 173 seats. I don't believe they lost any councils, though. But this many seats they were defending, they did lose either to Reform, to Lib Dem, possibly even Green. And the number one reason that those voters cited was the loss of the winter fuel payments. Finally, I said that really there is no reason, considering how that the GDP for UK is actually going to decrease, how the debt is actually getting larger, which means there's going to be less money in the budget because the GDP is going to be less to pay for that debt. And you're not going to take it out of entitlements, although they are starting to take it out of certain programs. And I said, really, there is no reason why Prime Minister Keir Starmer should have allowed that 10% base tariff on their exports to remain that are going to the United States. But I said imports instead of exports. And that was a couple times. As you can tell in these podcasts, I take my time to explain things. So that way then you really understand the topics and really understand what we're doing here and what's going on in the world. Now, I had mentioned to you in the last podcast that I had a listener, and that listener said they really would like an explanatory, or an explanation-like podcast, because some of these concepts can be a little challenging if you've never heard them before. So I'm going to do that as well. And the reason why I just brought that up is because some of these things you may have some idea about, but you don't fully understand how it impacts you as a voter. Say the GDP and the debt. But I will be sure to go ahead and do that podcast so you can fully understand it. So that way then when you're making your vote, you're making the most well-informed vote. You're voting with, your complete mind, your complete conscience, in understanding who is the best candidate that's going to represent your values. So just to give you a little preview of what we're going to talk about today, we are going to go ahead and get into how Moody, which is a crediting agency, downgraded the U.S. credit. We'll get to that here shortly. Apparently, Liberation Day Part 2 is back on. Walmart is saying we're going to pass the cost of these tariffs down to the consumers, obviously, and Trump doesn't like it. It's interesting how anytime we might get aware of how these tariff costs are going to affect us, the consumer, he gets really upset. Like there was a story leaked by not by Amazon. There's just a story leaked, that said that Amazon was planning to put the tariff surcharge on their website. So when you purchase something from Amazon, you would know how much more the product is because of tariffs. And Trump lost it, called it a hostile act, and was like, this shouldn't happen. Well, yeah, he has a problem with tariffs once the American consumer can find out how much the tariffs could potentially cost them, how much it will cost their pocketbooks. So we'll get in. I mean, and of course, it turned out that the story was actually not true. Perhaps it was leaked. I don't know. But it was just interesting to see his reaction, how he was saying it was hostile. Why would it be hostile? If Amazon wants to put how much these tariffs are costing consumers, I say go for it. You know, and if Walmart is saying, look, for us to continue to be competitive, for us to be able to maintain the employees that we have, and to be able to be responsible to our shareholders, we're going to have to pass these costs on to the consumers. I mean, they would know. And if Trump has a problem with it, then he could just cancel the tariffs. He could just stop. So we'll get into that. We're also going to get into some culture pieces. We're going to talk about, I mean, have you ever, as a kid, were you afraid of the boogeyman? Have you heard of the boogeyman? This might be more of a Gen Xer and a Boomer thing. Millennials and Gen Z might be like, who's the boogeyman? Well, ideally, or what it was, not ideally, what it was apparently there was this like scary person in your closet who would come out and scare you. And I think some parents use this story to try to get kids to behave well. So we're going to get into how a child had their own boogeyman, but it wasn't the boogeyman. It was John Wilkes Booth. And if you don't know who John Wilkes Booth is, think assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So we'll get to that, how this kid became terrified of John Wilkes Booth. We're also going to talk about another kid who got on their mother's phone and ordered 7,000 dum-dums. Actually, no, excuse me. It might be more. It might be 75,000. Yes, I think it was 75,000 dum-dums. We'll get into that. Just to kind of give you my thoughts on that. Most people would be like, oh, that kid needs to be punished, shouldn't do that. But you know what here? There might be a different viewpoint here. Maybe this kid had a reason for this. We have to hear this kid out here, okay? And then the final news story, or the pop culture or culture story I have for you, is about a jailbreak of the magnitude of Alcatraz, about those 3 prisoners who escaped Alcatraz. Now, not as daunting in regards to the Alcatraz escape, because remember, no one had ever escaped Alcatraz, the Rock, and then these 3 did it. Well, the authorities said they drowned, you know, as they were trying to get back to San Francisco, as they crossed the channel there. Not the English Channel, by the way, which I've been to and I love it, but that body of water there between Alcatraz and the San Francisco beach. But I'm going to tell you something. If you get that far, I don't think a channel's going to stop you from your freedom, bro. I think they made it. But we'll never know. Maybe they didn't. You never know. There's sharks there, you know. But this was another jailbreak. It was in New Orleans, and 10 prisoners escaped. So I hope that gives you enough to whet your appetite. I'm going to stick in the UK, where things, and just so you know, for those of you who are more, you know, you're not from the United Kingdom, we're only going to do a couple stories from the United Kingdom, and then we're transitioning to the world, and then we're going to get back into the U.S. news. So that way then you have an idea of how this is going to go for the rest of the podcast. The beautiful thing about Spotify, by the way, is they're actually breaking it up by chapters. So if you do listen to this podcast on Spotify, you'll be able to see that and forward as you like. So, as I was talking to you about corrections, the reason why, remember, labor came in on this huge wave because everybody was tired of conservative leadership, of the Tories. So the conservative side of the party. Reform did very well, so did Lib Dems, liberal Democrats, which are like the progressives. So did Labor, and Green actually did well as well. So there was a huge tsunami for the left and a repudiation of conservative leadership under the Tories. And as I was mentioning to you, they left a big deficit. Well, years of many deficits, which is like a large amount of debt that is now in Labor's hands because they've inherited the government. But the path that Labor has been taking, like canceling the winter fuel payments, which came back and bit them because voters didn't like that. The Labor voters are going to want to still have winter fuel payments, not have them cut. And now talking about, in the last podcast, I talked about the other cuts that they are talking about to benefits for the middle class, for the poor, and for the marginalized. And they're draconian in nature. And I brought up in that podcast, why are they not acting more as in a Labor fashion, trying to find other ways to be able to not have the budget in a deficit, to be able to fund the government, and to be able to pay down the debt. Like, there has to be other ways besides taking it from the middle class, the poor, and the marginalized. And I saw this comes from the Independent in the United Kingdom, and it says, calls for the wealth tax as rich list shows that 772 billion pounds, which is probably $1 trillion in US dollars or close to it, is in the hands of just 350 families. So here we go again. Labor. Are you going to be Labor? I mean, you won on the biggest mandate except for Tony Blair, who had the largest labor mandate ever. And here you have this opportunity to go ahead and to, as you're pointing out, right the wrongs of how the conservatives handled the government fiscally, how they handled it financially, but you're taking it out on your base, on the middle class, on the poor and the marginalized, when you could apply a wealth tax to 350 families who have about 772 billion in assets. Horrible. I can guarantee you, I'm pretty sure the liberal Dems don't have a problem with this. Pretty sure the Greens don't have a problem with this. And I bet you those 40 to 80 MPs who are really weary and leery about voting for those cuts don't have a problem with this wealth tax to try and shore up the deficit in the budget and to try and pay down the debt, or at least prevent the debt from growing. And that's why it shouldn't be surprising to anybody listening here that this comes from also the UK, that over half of Labour's 2024 vote are considering switching to Liberal Democrats, which are progressives, or Greens, which are just the Greens. Incredible. And this is showing you how poorly the Labour government, the established party for the left, is performing right now for the half, and probably even those, let me say this first, half of their vote. So half of the left's vote, half of their tsunami vote is now considering switching to Liberal Democrats or to Greens. Imagine if we had that in the United States, where if we were upset with one of those parties, like say the Democrats aren't performing well, or say the Republicans aren't performing well, you would have another party to go to let that establishment party know you're not happy with how they are managing the government and representing you in government. This is why multiple parties is incredible. This is why a parliamentary system is, I think, necessary. I plan to write another book one day, and I'm going to talk about that. But, for now, just know, Labor, that if you want to get those voters back, you need to start acting more like Labor and not like a Tory, not like a conservative. And not surprisingly, Keir Starmer's popularity has sank to a record low in polls. That comes from the Financial Times. So, obviously we're talking international. We're going to keep on international news. But before we transition off of that, just to put a bow on this, Labor, when the time to strike on the iron is when the iron is hot. That is when you go ahead and do these policies that those voters were hoping for. They were hoping for more hope and for more help and more support. That's why they voted you into office. Not to have you cut benefits. Not to have you take away the winter fuel payments. All of those things they could have received under Tory leadership, under conservative leadership. So, as I said before with Donald Trump and his tariffs, and he had to do a 180 in regards to some of his fiscal policies, I'm going to say the same for the Labor government. They need to do a 180 and fast. And if they don't, it's going to be a brutal election for them, I think. And you have to be a little worried because voters may not just go to, say, liberal Dems or to Green. They may choose Reform too. And to be honest with you, out of all the parties that still remain, Reform is the one that worries me the most in regards to having still national health care, in regards to all of those safety net programs that are still in the UK, other reasons as well. So, Labor, I'm going to say for you, crack on and be bloody brilliant already, okay? That was for my UK folks. We're going to transition now. We're going to still stay in international news. And I was mentioning to you before in the last podcast how there was going to be how President Trump had spoken quite strongly and had went ahead with his with our allies, in the EU, and has stated that if Russia would not agree to a 30-day ceasefire, that they were going to go ahead and add more sanctions. And then, of course, Vladimir Putin agrees to this meeting. And I gave you my prediction. I really felt like, I don't know, Vladimir, something was going to happen, wasn't going to go, or the meeting wasn't going to happen, or they were going to go and they were going to say, we're not going to do it. And why? Because you can't, Winston Churchill already told you, you can't appease an alligator. And Vladimir Putin is an alligator. And I honestly believe, he's not going to be satiated until he has taken over all of Ukraine. Now, I could be wrong on that, but so far he hasn't shown me anything to think otherwise. You take Crimea, and then 7 years later you attack Ukraine to conquer it, to steal all of its land and to subjugate all of its people under your rule. I'm not seeing anything that tells me otherwise. And after these, I think there were 2-hour talks. Putin didn't even go, by the way. I don't know how I guessed that. He didn't go. He sent his delegation. Now, Sergei Lavrov was there, and he's kind of like Putin's right-hand man. So it wasn't totally, what's the word? I'm trying to think of another word besides diss, but not treated it as seriously, because he should have been there. Honestly, I thought if Vladimir's not going to go, then Volodymyr shouldn't have gone either. As a way of saying, you know what, I'm not going to waste my time with anymore. If you want to have peace, then meet with me. But he went. And now, Putin is rejecting the peace plan per Financial Times. Not surprising. He made these unrealistic demands. I'm not going to even go through it. You already know that, this is just how it's going to be. He's going to come up with some reason as to why he can't accept the peace plan, why he can't accept the ceasefire. Donald Trump today called Vladimir Zelensky, called Vladimir Putin, was insisting there has to be a ceasefire. Trump is really, I would say, he's actually, he is being active here. He is really trying to get this ceasefire now. There's a difference in his actions. It's not just a statement and then nothing for 2 months. He talked about sanctions, and then now they had the meeting, and now he's calling both of them to try and get the ceasefire. But as I mentioned to you before, and all I'm doing is echoing what Winston Churchill said, you can't appease an alligator. And what's going to happen is Vladimir is going to push, and he wants to see if the United States and the EU are really going to apply sanctions. He doesn't believe it, because he still feels that he could create a wedge between the US and the EU. Now, I don't know how to categorize Donald Trump's and Vladimir Putin's relationship, but I will say this. It's different than Biden's and Vladimir's relationship. It's different than Obama's and Vladimir's relationship. And I'm not trying to say that Biden and Vladimir had a better relationship, they responded better to Putin. I want to say that. Let me say this. I think they did because they recognized Putin as the threat that they are. And I think Trump was really trying to find a way to try and bring Russia into the fold. Now, I do think that. But the point is, at one point, you have to let that go and recognize you are dealing with an alligator. You have to use the same hardball tactics that you've used with Russia, with our allies, and with Iran. That's when he's at his best. Now, if he won't do it, if Donald Trump won't place sanctions after he said that he would, after Vladimir won't agree to a ceasefire, the question is why? So we're going to see. Meanwhile, Pope Leo XIV has offered the Vatican as a venue for talks between Ukraine and Russia. Awesome. I think that's great. I didn't say this in my last podcast, but I had placed it on my Facebook. Pope Leo XIV has said that Russia has to stop their imperialistic invasion of Ukraine. I mean, fantastic. I don't think Vladimir is going to accept the invitation anymore, Papa. Pope Leo XIV. Ever since you called it what it is, which is an imperialistic invasion of Ukraine. But it's nice that he's offered the Vatican. My question is, can Vladimir really walk into the Vatican? I mean, of course he has the invitation from the Pope, so he can. But won't the heavens strike him down with a lightning bolt? Or won't he just go up in flames? Now you might say, that's not funny. You're talking about someone's soul there. Vladimir Putin, that alligator, is responsible for at least 2 million dead. 2 million. 1 million innocent Russians, 1 million Ukrainians, maybe more. So I bring up an interesting point. Would he get struck down by lightning if he tried to get into the Vatican? Would he go into flames? Now I know, from a Christian perspective, Jesus Christ died for your sins, past, present, and future. I don't know if that's going to work for Vladimir. Because, he also says, truly I don't know you when he comes back. So I don't know. Look, I'm not trying to speak about Vladimir's soul here. All I'm trying to tell you is the man's responsible for 2 million deaths. It's really clear in the Quran. They say we've prepared a fire for them that will envelop them on all sides. This is talking about the heedless ones. And when they ask for help, they'll be met with water like molten metal. What a terrible drink. And now you're saying, whoa, this podcast just went off the rails. Well, yeah, it did. Because we're forgetting that 2 million are dead for a needless war. Because of some man's ambition and greed to try and recreate the Soviet Union, at least in regards to territory. So yeah, it went off the rails just like he's gone off the rails. So I'm going to bring it back for you. But I don't know. I mean, would he get struck by lightning? Enough of that. Let's move off of that. I hope you enjoyed that little side note. But let's continue from there and let's bring it back domestically. And that wasn't really a that wasn't a segue at all. It was just a transition. And I'm going to bring up again, here we are domestically with the tariffs. And you might say, oh my gosh, what happens now? Well, as you know, there's been pauses with the tariffs between U.S. and China, at least to the levels they were. They're now at 30% for Chinese exports and 10% for U.S. exports. And then, of course, on the world, there's been a pause, but a 10% flat tariff placed in place. Well, Donald Trump has come out and has said that in 2 to 3 weeks, we're going to go ahead and place those tariffs back on the countries, on all of them. So buckle up, because Liberation Day Part 2 is coming. The first one went so well. I mean, the market only went into bear territory. What can happen this time? I don't know. Trump says, it's not possible to do a trade agreement with 130 countries. Yeah, man. When did you figure that one out? I mean, come on here. So, I'm not sure what's going to happen. But, the nice recovery that we've received ever since the Trump administration has done a 180 in regards to pausing Liberation Day, as in regards to lowering the tariffs in China, it may look like that recovery is about to vanish again. Now, I don't know, to be honest with you, but we're going to see. The market did well on absorbing the credit news, which we're going to get to in a little bit by Moody. Meanwhile, Walmart executives are stating that the tariffs are still too high. Well, they're at 30%. They import a lot from China. That's still significant. Remember, we have 25% tariff war going on with Canada. Canada even, and a little credit to Prime Minister Carney, he had to allow for certain goods that are important for or essential and crucial for their businesses. He had to remove that tariff on U.S. exports, on some of the things, because he recognized how important it was for his economy and the industry. I mean, again, this is a global trading world now. And these tariffs are going to have, well, they already have. They've had, really detrimental impacts. And the question is, and nobody knows, how far, how deep, how large, how, I want to say destructive, but how hurtful, that's the word. How hurtful will these tariffs be? So Walmart is saying 30% still too high. It is. And they're going to have to pass it down to the consumer, which I told you, that's what happens with tariffs, which of course is going to increase inflation. Trump is upset and saying, stop trying to blame tariffs for price increases. No, Donald, that is exactly why Walmart's increasing their prices. Walmart's known for low prices. Roll back the happy face. Roll back the prices. They don't want to increase their prices. You're putting them in a situation where they have to. Again, you can't be America first and place a company like Walmart in a position where they have to either pass on the cost to the consumer or eat the tariff themselves. And you can't be America first if you're not worried about the cost being passed on to the consumer, to the American consumer. All you have to do is repeal the tariffs. I mean, you're seeing how the economy is recovering ever since he has walked back his policies. So if you just remove the tariffs, the economy is going to be humming again. The market's going to be humming. Instead, look out for 2 to 3 weeks. It's going to get interesting. Quickly here, though, I always keep it balanced. And before I get to the Moody piece, which is about downgrading the U.S. credit, I just want to go ahead and give credit where credit is due. President Trump had a great trip in the Middle East. He secured a $600 billion investment from Saudi, $14.5 billion from Etihad, which is like Saudi airline, I believe, for Boeing planes. Also $200 billion in agreements with the UAE, which is United Arab Emirates. Also another Boeing deal with Qatar Airways to buy up to 210 planes. And he removed sanctions from Syria, which, fantastic. That had to be done. Dictator, I don't want to say president, but President Bashar al-Assad is now gone from that country. And there's no reason to have those sanctions there. So good for Syria. I'm hoping with those sanctions gone, their economy can get going. And I believe Saudi Arabia and the UAE, I may be wrong on that, but I know Saudi was part of it, have paid the Syria's debt. So good for Syria. I'm excited to see where they go. I don't know where their credit rating is. It's kind of interesting. If you were just starting off, where would your credit rating be? I don't know. I'm not one of those credit raters. But Moody, which is one of the credit raters, has downgraded the U.S. credit and citing our rising debt and our unsustainable path and not really addressing it as to reasons why. So that's not good. You could just think about yourself and your own credit report, right? And if it goes down, this is like going down substantially. So this would be like if you were in the 700s, it was a perfect rating, it was a AAA rating, and now you go down to the 600s. Maybe the low 600s, maybe the 500s. I don't really know how it translates, but I want to give you an idea of how monumental this is. It's a big deal. And we've been talking about the debt and about how it's increasing every year. In fact, it increases $2 trillion every year, just so you know. But I have some figures for you just to kind of give you an idea of how bad it really is. And the reason why I want to bring it up is because a lot of times we're told this story that it's because of spending while the debt is so big. And there isn't really discussions about how tax cuts have actually increased the debt, which makes sense if you think about it, because if you're cutting revenue, then obviously you might run deficits, which then increases the debt. And again, I'm going to do an explanatory podcast that explains all of this. But for now, just think about it this way. If you have to borrow money to pay for your expenses, that's increasing your debt. So when you think about debt here, think about when you're paying things on your credit card. That's when you're increasing debt, or you take out money out of your credit card to pay off certain things. That's what this is. Now, since 2000, the U.S. debt has increased by 540%. That is an astronomical figure. 540%. In 2000, the debt was at 5.67 trillion. It's now at 36.2 trillion, which, as I said, is that 538% increase. Now, the question you got to ask yourself, now you can understand why Moody went ahead and downgraded the credit rating for the United States government. Because they're like, you guys aren't addressing this, and it's continuing to grow. So we have issues. Now, it started me thinking, like, well, what countries do have a good credit rating? And I was thinking, like, oh, maybe all the G7 countries do. Surprise! Only Canada and Germany do. So then I went ahead and I asked GBT, give me the countries that have AAA ratings. It's not very many, by the way. But there is something they have in common. Except for one, which is Singapore. So I don't want to get into that too much because it's a whole other economic topic. But let's just say Singapore is the anomaly. Out of all the countries that do have a good credit rating, a AAA rating, their marginal tax rate is in the 40s or higher. Luxembourg, 42%. Denmark, 52%. Netherlands, 49.5%. Norway, 47.4%. Sweden, 52%. Australia, 45%. Canada, 47%. Germany, 45%. I think I'm missing one there. But you should see what's in common here. They have a high marginal tax rate. Our tax rate, as you know, is not nearly to that amount. The Trump tax cuts brought it down. So it brings up this question and the reason why these countries have a good credit rating is because they have a higher marginal tax rate and they don't have huge debt because they have more revenue to pay off their debt and not to have huge deficits. By the way, these countries have great social programs, free education, free healthcare, either free education or subsidized education, highly subsidized. Many more social safety net programs. So they're able to afford it. Now, what happened here? How did this debt grow, 538%? Well, we have to go back to this one important time. Our tax rate used to be 70%, which is, really high, by the way. And when Reagan came into office, he came in on a mandate. And he passed the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 and lowered the tax rate from 70% to 50%. Now remember, Reagan's a Republican. Now if we just would have kept that tax rate at 50% and the corporate tax rate went from, I believe, 46% to 34% on the next bill that he passed, which we'll get to in a minute, because that's where things went awry. But if we would have kept that 34% corporate tax rate and a 50% tax rate on the high earners, that's the high marginal tax rate on high earners, if we would have done that, then our debt would be 38.45% lower. Almost 40% lower if we would have kept that tax rate and corporate tax rate. And why wouldn't Republicans want to do that? It's Reagan. That was a fair tax rate. Now, he cut it from 70 to 50% because we were going through stagflation. There was a lot of things happening then, a lot of economic issues. And so he lowered the tax rate to spur investment and to spur GDP growth. And it worked. Our debt would be at, I think, 22.4 trillion instead of 36.5 trillion. 40% lower if we would have kept that tax rate. Now that's important, and some of you have been like, well, how is this important? Well, right now they're talking about cutting Medicaid, right? And cutting food stamps. They're saying how we can't afford Social Security. And remember, with Social Security, we've paid into it our whole lives. You're not going to take that money away from us. These are entitlement programs. So if they actually would have kept those tax rates as they were, we wouldn't be in the crisis that we are now, and we wouldn't have Republicans saying, or maybe we still would, which would be really interesting, saying we need to cut Medicaid, SNAP, and you know what, Social Security is unsustainable, we should just privatize it. No, you're not going to do that. We're going to go ahead and move that tax rate back to where it needs to be, and also the corporate tax rate. Those tax Trump cuts have not paid for themselves. They added to the deficit. Here's what I'm trying to tell you. All of the tax cuts since that one of 1981, all they have done is add to the deficit and the debt. Well, excuse me, they've created deficits which have added to the debt. If we would have kept this tax rate, we would have had 21 balanced budgets. Can you believe that? Right now, we've had maybe 5 total in history, mostly during the Clinton years. So, the Fed, they're not in charge of fiscal policy, meaning, the policies that the government does in regards to tax cuts or stimulating growth. They have monetary policy, which we talked about in terms of cutting interest rates and buying bonds and stuff. Again, I'll explain this more in another podcast. But the Fed has said we're on an unsustainable path. So at some point, they need to go ahead and bring these tax rates back to where they used to be. And unfortunately, it's so late now, we might have to do other things. That's probably not going to be enough. But that's the first measure. And, no increase on taxes for anyone except for the top marginal and for the corporate tax rate. Everyone else wouldn't have their taxes increased. Now, here's the thing. It's been, if you're the top marginal tax rate and you're listening to this, and of course you don't like what is being said, remember, you've had a 40-year break, man. 40 years. I know many of you have put this money away. And now that 40-year break, that 40-year leave is over. It's time to go ahead and start paying down the debt. It's time to start taking care of these budget deficits, of this long-standing debt. I mean, the way to really kind of bring this home, to say there's been enough time that the top marginal tax rate has had. The top 0.1%, so the top 0.01% of U.S. households now average $162 million in net worth. So their net worth, if you're in the top 0.01%, the average is $162 million. That's a 400% increase since the 2000. In 2000, it was 40 million. Has your net worth increased 400% since 2000? If you're listening to this podcast, likely not. And if you are, I'm hoping you have seen the value and the purpose of why we need to go ahead and to handle this debt and to make sure we can continue to fund the government and all that it does. Wow, this podcast is going a little bit longer than I suspected. I had thought I would start talking to you about these funny stories earlier. We're going to transition now. We may not have time to talk about the other issue that I wanted to talk about today. We'll see. Actually, we probably can do it. I probably can get it in. We have 11 minutes. 10 and a half minutes. Here we go. Okay. First thing I want to bring up is I want to get back to this toddler who has a surprising fear of John Wilkes Booth being under her bed. Now, the mother's name is Cassie. Correct? Yes. I don't have the name of the child. I'm sorry. But you can look it up. It comes from People. And they took her to the Ford Theater in D.C. and they showed her John Wilkes Booth and said what happened. And it absolutely freaked her out. And didn't say that he assassinated. They just said he hurt President Lincoln. He hurt President Lincoln. Then they went into, I think, a production or like a performance of it. And then at that point, this little girl knew what John Wilkes Booth had done and was completely terrified of John Wilkes Booth. So much so that they were at church. And this is what Cassie says. We were at church, which is the mother of this child. We were at church on Sunday. And the preacher was talking about how Jesus loves us. She looked at me and she said, "Mommy, I love Jesus." And Cassie said, "That's awesome. I'm glad you do." Then our little one said, "Jesus loves us." And Cassie said, "Yes, that's right." And then the little one said, "But you know who we don't love?" And Cassie, who's the mommy, said, "Who?" She said, "John Wilkes Booth." We don't love John Wilkes Booth. And apparently she's terrified of him being under the bed like the boogeyman. Here's what I'm wondering is it possible, and this is like a Doctor Who segue, is it possible that Abraham Lincoln is really this toddler? And when she saw the John Wilkes Booth demonstration at Ford Theater, she freaked out. Like she was Abraham Lincoln in another life, like Doctor Who, and then reincarnated into this little girl. I mean, how else do you explain this? My Doctor Who fans, are you with me? Now remember, if you're sitting there and you're like, "Well, I don't know much about reincarnation," but you can't like reincarnate to a woman, can you, if you're a man? Yeah, you can. They do it in Doctor Who. So I think this little girl, she was Abraham Lincoln in a past life. She was Abraham Lincoln. And then has come back as this little girl. No, she probably just has some irrational fear about John Wilkes Booth. Moving on. And you can tell my segues aren't the best today. I apologize. Sometimes I have them for you. Sometimes I'll just say I'm moving on. This story is the one we were talking about earlier. This is the one where the inmates escaped. I was talking to you about Alcatraz. This happened on May 16th, and it wasn't just 3. It was 10 inmates who escaped from the New Orleans Justice Center. They exploited a structural vulnerability by removing a toilet and breaching a wall behind it. And then they exited a loading dock and scaled a fence. Now, here's the thing. Before they left, when they had removed this toilet and exploited this hole in the wall to get through, they left some graffiti. They tagged it. And they said, "Too easy. LOL. And we're innocent." I mean, that's just like adding insult to injury. Salt to my wounds. So, 6 are still at large. They've caught 4 of them. Thanks to the federal marshals. By the way, the federal marshals, I mean, I don't think they give enough credit around here. Enough praise either. They're incredible. You have prisoners that escape or parole. Well, I don't know, maybe parolees. That may be the parole officer. I don't know, but definitely prisoners escape. And the federal marshals are on it, man. Love the federal marshals. Like that movie Fugitive. But so they said we're innocent. Here's what's really alarming and kind of worries me. This New Orleans Justice Center has been criticized. It's just a jail, by the way. And it's been criticized for housing high-risk inmates despite infrastructure and staffing challenges. Well, that isn't very smart. Number one, I understand when you have people awaiting trial, they're in jails and they're not in prison. But that means you better have this jail secured enough to be able to handle these inmates. And apparently there already had been criticism on that, about housing these high-risk inmates despite the infrastructure and staffing challenges. Sheriff Susan Hudson acknowledged that the facility was not designed for such high-security detainees and that the escape highlighted the need for improvements. Yeah, I would say so. And they better start listening to the sheriff or whoever criticized it and go ahead and actually, what's the word here? Escape-proof it? Or at least do better. So I said that we weren't going to go past an hour anymore. And I had these other news to give you, but I'm going to save that for next week. And we're just going to go ahead and end on this other culture piece. And that'll put us right at the hour. And that way then I hold my promise to you. And we'll just do this next week. That's the beautiful thing about a podcast. We can bring it up. And this piece that I was going to bring you, it's not actually, say like a timely news piece. Like something that, like for example, when Liberation Day first happened. If I was talking about it now, as if it was news, like if it was new, you'd be like, bro, that happened so long ago. But this is just an actual piece about how difficult it is now, not only to live in California, but also in the United States, the high housing costs. And it's really talking about, the effects of gentrification, which I write about in my book, How I Became Homeless with a Master's Degree. And just a lot of good statistics and pieces, like articles that I had found that I wanted to share with you. And we'll go ahead and save that for next week. So we'll end with this last culture piece. And this was about that little girl, or was it a little boy here? Hold on for a second. Oh yeah, it was a little boy. And his name was Liam. And he took his mom's phone. And her name is Holly LaFave, I think. Or Mrs. LaFavors. Sorry, Mrs. LaFavors, either way. He ordered 75,000 dum-dum suckers. It was 22 cases from Amazon that arrived at her home. She tried to stop him. He was 8 years old, by the way. Now, you might think, well, that seems odd that an 8-year-old's doing that. I'm going to tell you, me working in the field and working with families, this is not as uncommon as you think. So if you're a parent, you may want to make sure you have lockdowns on your phone. Specifically, have some sort of PIN or some sort of screener password. Because kids are getting in there and they're savvy enough to know how to order stuff. Whether it's for their Roblox, in this case, it was for these dum-dum suckers. And it was $4,000. And she was able to eventually get her money back when she talked to other news agencies and spoke with Amazon. I guess, there was some pressure there, or, I don't know how that whole refund works, but she got her money back. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, that's a kid. He needs to be, told right and wrong, needs to be given a consequence. The mother here was really, open to what the kid had to say. And what did Liam want to do with this? He told me he wanted to have a carnival. And he was ordering the dum-dums as prizes for his carnivals. And he wanted to give them to his friends. He was being friendly. He wanted to be kind to his friends. So, here's what I'm thinking. This kid might be a little entrepreneurial genius in the making. Think about it. He wants to have a carnival. He wants to invite all his friends. 75,000 dum-dums. You do one for each friend. That's 75,000 people at a carnival. That's lit. That is a huge party. Imagine the revenue he gets. Sure, he puts in 4,000, but how much more is he going to get at the carnival? People go there spending on the carnival tickets to get into the carnival. I mean, this kid, I'm going to keep my eye on you, Liam. Just kidding, I'm not. But I'm just saying, there's always another way to look at things. And maybe this kid has an entrepreneurial spirit in him. And one day he's going to be, I don't know, throwing a big conference. Or throwing a big party. Or, making a big carnival. I mean, he looks like he has it. He looks like he has the stuff to do it. The one thing I would say, though, and this is just a piece of advice, Liam, go with blow pops next time. Don't go with dum-dums. My gosh. And all my listeners better be on board with this. If you're comparing a blow pop to a dum-dum, a blow pop absolutely eviscerates a dum-dum every time. Now, a kid, you can't blame the kid. Kid's 8 years old. Maybe he's had 1 or 2 dum-dums in his life. Says, give me 75,000 dum-dums. Should have been blow pops. Now that would have been a lit carnival with blow pops. All right. That's it. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Thank you for listening to El Maestro. We will see you in a couple of days. And stay lit.